A few hours ago, my husband, my daughter, and myself attended a screening of Wham! 10 Days in China, which is a documentary that was only shown in cinemas for one day. It was a one-time global cinematic event, and I'm very glad that we were able to go. For those who don't know, Wham! Has been very important to me since roughly kindergarten when they broke through in the US. So being able to see this documentary about their historic visit to China was really cool. Plus, it gives me an excuse to talk about Wham! On my movie channel. As the name implies, Wham! 10 Days in China chronicles Wham's 10 Days in China when they played two shows and became the first Western pop act to play in mainland China. This was, of course, both a pivotal moment culturally and for Wham's career. They were pretty popular in their native Britain at this point, but hadn't really broken through globally yet. So this version of the documentary is directed by Christie, but it covers the story of a scrapped version of the documentary directed by Lindsay Anderson. Now, I'm going on the assumption that this will be released to a streaming service or two, and hopefully will be released on physical media so I can add it to my collection. With that in mind, I'm going to avoid major spoilers and just give you kind of a vague synopsis. So the two shows Wham played, one was in Beijing and one was in Guangzhou. And what I found really interesting was the contrast between the audiences and the overall environment in those two cities. Guangzhou apparently has a lot more pop culture influence than Beijing did. And so the audience in Guangzhou was a lot more receptive than Beijing. It was like night and day. So seeing that contrast was really interesting. And seeing how the different reactions affected Andrew and George was also really interesting. So the documentary reveals, through the archive footage and new interviews, that this trip was kind of a calculated move on Wham's part because their goal was to break through in the US market. And they knew that something this culturally significant would get a lot of news coverage and it would help them a bit with that goal. And indeed, it did help. They broke through to the US, which is when I discovered them. And they did a series of sold-out stadium shows across our country. Unfortunately, I didn't get to attend one of those, but it was still a really big deal. What I found especially touching were the interviews with people who attended the shows and how it changed their lives. The cinema experience was pretty good. However, there was a couple next to me where the husband kept cracking jokes and the wife kept singing, but she was doing so over the talking because they'd show a clip of a live performance and then they'd show someone talking, but she wanted to finish the line of the song first. And so I was just sort of sitting there like, okay. We get that you know the songs. That's great. I mean, this was a one-time event, so it's not like I could just go back tomorrow and watch it again. So that was a little distracting, but what are you going to do? I mean, I'm glad everyone seemed to be having a good time. That was nice. So my personal history with Wham is quite long. It goes back pretty darn far. I will give you the short, condensed version so you don't have to sit here all day and listen to me. So, from my recollection, I was quite young. But as I remember it, I was first introduced to Wham through my elementary school's janitor, Marty. He played the Make It Big album over the intercom system in the school as he was cleaning. My mother and I were there late one night because she was the president of the PTA and she was finishing up some paperwork and such. And so he was cleaning and, he was helping lock up for us and all that stuff. So he put it on and I was just entranced. And then I believe somewhere around that same time, they started playing Wake Me Up Before You Go Go on the radio a lot. And so I think I may have heard that song first before I heard the rest of the album from Marty. I'm not really sure. So then the videos started rolling out and I became fascinated with Andrew Ridgeley. After the initial crush kind of wore off, I started to focus on the music more as I got older, and I really appreciated George's voice, and he became one of the biggest inspirations to me with my own singing. Now, Make It Big was the first album that kind of hit the US, and they had had an album previous that was called Fantastic. So when I found the cassette of Fantastic, it said Wham UK Fantastic. So I thought the album was called UK Fantastic. But later I found out it said Wham UK as the band name because apparently there was a band called Wham in the US at the time. So they did that to differentiate between the two. So the packaging and everything just said Wham, but then on the cassette itself it said Wham UK. I called it by the wrong name for quite a while. So then, of course, Last Christmas became a thing. And my birthday is in December, as some of you know. And it became kind of a tradition that I would listen to Last Christmas on my birthday to kind of usher in the holiday season. Because my mom was kind of adamant that we not celebrate Christmas or decorate for Christmas or anything until after my birthday. She wanted my birthday to be its own thing. So that was sort of the tradition, was I would play Last Christmas at night on my birthday, and that would sort of, end the birthday and start Christmas. So when Wham broke up, I was quite bitter, as an Andrew fan, and I blamed George, of course. It was years later until I found out the true story, that it was a very amicable breakup and it was a mutual decision. I mean, they knew that they were a good time band, as George called them in the song Freedom 90. And that kind of thing has a short shelf life. And they knew that. They were just in it for the fun of it. And Andrew knew that George was blossoming into a superstar. And he knew it was time for him to be on his own. And, that the era of Wham, they had kind of outgrown that style and that era of their lives. So they had known each other since second or third grade or something like that. And so they had a long history. And Andrew's big thing with George was helping him have the confidence to perform. He was very shy and introverted, and Andrew was more of the extrovert and, the one who wanted the female attention and the fame and all that. So it was really a good partnership because, he helped kind of give George the push that he needed. So once it became clear that that was no longer necessary, he just kind of stepped aside. So I didn't know that at the time, of course. And I was just upset that they had broken up. What started to melt my freeze out was when George released the duet with Aretha Franklin, I Knew You Were Waiting for Me, which I still really loved. The thing that completely won me over, though, was seeing the music video for Kissing a Fool. I saw that Dion Estes was still playing bass for George, and I took that as some sort of heartwarming gesture, like, oh, okay, he hasn't completely turned his back on those days. And so that was all it took, and that song won me over. That is still my favorite song to this day. So, time marched on. George's Listen Without Prejudice album became one of my favorites of all time. And, it just kept going, and I just kept loving his voice. And nearly 10 years ago now, on Christmas, we lost George. And that kind of ruined the song Last Christmas for me for quite a while. I can kind of listen to it now. There were a few years there where I was just not willing to listen to that song because it was such a cruel irony that he would pass on Christmas. My father also passed on Christmas in 1981. So yeah, that I don't have a great history with Christmas. It does happen to be my husband's birthday though, so that helps. Speaking of my husband, he's the one who let me know when the word came that George had passed. I was running a bath for our daughter. I still remember that. Kind of in my own head, and the water running, I could barely hear anything. And my husband just kind of tapped me, and he held the iPad close to his chest, and he said, "I don't want to tell you this." And I said, "What?" And I thought he was going to say that Carrie Fisher had passed because she was very ill at the time. She ended up passing a few days later, in fact. But I said, "Carrie?" And he said, "No." And he turned the iPad around and it said, "Former Wham lead singer George Michael dead." And I just kind of felt the color drain out of me, what little there is to start with. And it hit me so hard because George had kind of a near-death experience happen. He had to have a tracheotomy and learn to sing again and everything. And so I guess in my head I figured, okay, we're out of the woods. He's fine, and then to have it happen like that, just kind of unceremoniously, was a little brutal. So therefore, watching this documentary, to circle back, it was an emotional experience. I only cried twice, I believe. The big one was near the end. There's a moment with Andrew where he's doing something alone that it really struck me that, George should be there and wasn't. And it was just, everyone in the theater kind of went, oh. It was just, it was such a touching moment. But anyhow, I won't get more specific than that in case you want to see this yourself, which I do recommend. In fact, I gave it 4 stars and the little orange heart on Letterboxd. So, yeah, it made a big impact. I really enjoyed it. I would highly recommend watching it, especially if you're a Wham fan or George Michael fan, or grew up with parents who were Wham fans, or grandparents at this point, I guess. I mean, I'm 47 and I'm in the younger batch of their fans. So, yeah. If you're someone who's really into pop culture and learning more about it, I think you'll appreciate it. But I'm hoping this documentary will kind of rekindle the popularity of Wham and George Michael. And it seems to be happening already. Judging by what I've seen on Letterboxd, there's a lot of young people who are like, "Oh, well, my mom is nuts about Wham and she dragged me along, but I love it. I love George Michael." Da, da, da. People are just kind of falling in love with his voice all over again. And it's really nice to see. It reminds me of the resurgence of Michael Jackson mania that's been going on since the biopic. On a much smaller scale, obviously, since this is a one-time cinematic event, not a billion-dollar worldwide phenomenon, but it is similar, that just that boost and the new generation discovering them. And I just love that. So, maybe, a month ago you would have said Wham to a Gen Z person and they'd say who? And maybe now they won't, and that's a big deal. And even as a fan, there were things in the documentary I didn't know. And, you know, there were stories I only know on the surface that went deeper. And there were some surprises, big surprises. And like I said, if you just have a curiosity about pop culture and pop music and all that, and, you know, political history and all that kind of stuff, I think it'll check a lot of boxes and appeal to a lot of people. So I'm hoping it does receive a wider release, and I'm hoping there will be a physical media release, so I have something to add. I don't have my watch with my monitor on it, so I'm not quite sure how this shot looks. Hopefully not horrible. But I just wanted to get my thoughts down on this. I'm sorry if I have waffled on, as my English friends would say. Rambled, in other words. I just wanted to get all this out while it was still fresh in my mind and while I was still feeling nostalgic. That's about all there is to say right now. But like I said, 4 stars and the heart on Letterboxd. And from what I've seen, it has a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes right now. And I don't really see that going down because it was a one-time event. So I don't think there will be many more reviews. So maybe it'll stay at a 100. And I don't think I've ever seen anything at an even 100 on Rotten Tomatoes before. I haven't checked IMDb yet, but it'll be interesting to see where it sits there. Maybe I'll look that up during the editing phase and put it here on the screen. So, thank you for watching and for listening to me reminisce. And I will hopefully see you again. Subscribe if you haven't yet. It's free. It's the same as a follow. I don't normally talk this much, don't worry.